Hello everyone, it's Melanie from Mel's Inky Fingers, and I am here to share tips and tricks for getting perfect heat embossing every time. Now, if you have never heat embossed before, you are in for a real treat because this is a showstopper. When I first started stamping, the very first card class I went to, I heat embossed a black sentiment on my project, and I was hooked from that point on. So let's talk about the supplies that you need if you're going to heat emboss on your projects. Now, if you look in the Stampin' Up! Catalog, there's a page that shares all of the supplies needed. So let's take a look. This is the May 2024, April 2025 annual catalog. And if you go to the index in the very back of the catalog, you're going to see a whole section right here in your index that says embossing, both heat and paste embossing on page 126. When you turn to page 126, you are going to find a list right here of all the supplies that you need. And you have options for your heat embossing. But basically you need three components. You need an ink to hold your powder, you need embossing powder, and then you need a tool to heat your powder. So let's take a look at what those items look like. When I heat emboss, I choose either my craft white ink or Versamark. And honestly, my go-to is really Versamark. I think it's a really sticky ink. I think it gives a really fine image on your stamp, which gives you really great definition for holding your powder. So it really is my go-to. Now that being said, there is no reason why your craft white ink pad won't work just as well. And this comes as an uninked pad and includes your ink refill when you order your pad. So here is your craft Stampin' ink here. You can get the pad and then you can get an extra refill because you will need to add that refill to your pad once it arrives. The other option here is Versamark ink. And both of these inks require frequent re-inking. So when you get your ink pads, I highly recommend you get the refills to go with them. And look, I'm almost out of Versamark. I need to get some more. Now, the Versamark requires re-inking less frequently than your craft white, but I find that most times I use my craft white. I like to add a little bit of ink to it because you really do want a nice crisp image when you stamp. Now I'm just noticing, I held class this morning and I'm noticing lots of black powder on my Versamark ink. So hopefully that doesn't translate onto the projects we're going to make today. So after you have chosen your ink pad and you've added a little bit of ink to make them nice and moist, your next option is choosing which color embossing powder you are going to work with. Now we have two collections of embossing powder. We have Wow Basics, which gives you your white, black, and clear, or you can choose Metallics, which gives you your gold, silver, and copper. Now, I empty my embossing powders into these little containers and then use little spoons. You can choose to store your powders however you would like that make them the easiest for you to use. Then last but not least is the heat tool. Stampin' Up! Has an amazing heat tool. I've had this for years and years and years. It's got both a low setting and a high setting, which is really great because I will frequently use my low setting to help dry things faster and for other uses other than heat embossing. But I love this heat tool. Now, what are some other things that make it easy for you to emboss? Well, this is one of my absolute favorite items in the Stampin' Up! Catalog. This is the Embossing Additions Toolkit, and it provides this tray for you that has this really neat end that opens so that you can take your powder and kind of dump it right back into your jar or container, making cleanup really neat, easy, and a snap. It gives you your embossing buddy, and this is an absolute must in my opinion. This is a powder containing a little like sock, and you rub it on your paper. You'll see me do that, and it removes the static from your paper. This helps ensure that your embossing powder only sticks to your ink giving you a clean, crisp image with no little fuzzy pieces around the rest of your paper. You also get this brush, which is really great for brushing away unwanted powder on your project or for cleanup. And then you get this really neat tool. It's a reversed tweezers to hold your paper, so when you're using your heat tool, you don't burn your fingers because it does get pretty hot. I use these tools just about every single time I emboss, especially these 3 items here. Now, I also keep a really small paintbrush by my craft area that is only used for heat embossing. So you can see that this brush gives you a nice wide bristle edge, but this one is really fine. So if I'm working with words or tiny little spaces and I have a clump of powder where I don't want it, I just take this brush and get right in there and brush it right off my page, and then I put it away, and it's not used for anything else. So the bristles are nice and clean and they stay together, so they work really nice for that purpose. Now, you don't have to have these tools, but I do find that they really make my embossing a lot easier. Then last but not least, you need to choose your stamp and your paper. So I'm going to work with mostly black and white so that you can see it easily with the contrast on camera, but you can mix and match any colors, metallics, cardstock colors with any of your stamps, and you'll get beautiful results. So I wanted to start with this. This is the Enjoying Little Things stamp set out of our September to December mini catalog. I love these sentiments. So I'm going to stamp a sentiment in white on this black cardstock to really help you see the difference between a couple of little steps in your embossing. So first of all, I am not going to use the embossing buddy, and I'm going to just stamp this sentiment and heat it with white embossing powder. And sometimes it turns out just fine, and sometimes you get stray bits across your paper. It just depends if there's any static. So when I'm working with my embossing powder, I take my embossing powder and set it inside this little embossing additions tray because it just does a really nice job of keeping your workspace neat. And then I get it ready for stamping. So once you stamp your image, you don't want to wait too long to add your powder, because as your ink dries, you will have less and less adhesion power for your powder. So I'm not going to do anything to this paper except ink it and adding my white powder. And this powder is going to stick to your ink, okay? So I'm just going to tap off the excess. And you can already see that the powder is sticking to the paper. So I'm just going to give it a good tap. And now we're going to heat this. Always cover your powder before you get your heat tool going, because that powder is really light and will blow everywhere. So let's heat this. And this is going to be a little loud. The heat tool will be a little loud as I heat, but you're going to notice this changing as it melts, so you will know when it's done. You do not want to overheat your powder because it does take away some of the shine, but you want to heat it just enough so that your powder melts and gets nice and smooth. So let's watch. So now the heat tool is warm enough that I see it starting to melt the powder. So I'm just going to move it very slowly as it melts. You'll see the powder getting smooth and shiny. All right. So you can see that there is some powder that got around my sentiment. So now we're going to do it again using this little guy. This is the embossing buddy, and I'm just going to rub it around on my paper And that's going to help remove any static that's there. And it's going to help the powder stick only where you want it to stick. And again, we're going to put some white embossing powder on here. So you can immediately see the difference. There's a lot less around the outside, around the sentiment. I also will sometimes blow on it hard. And you can see that also gets a lot of the scatter, I call it scatter, around your stamped image. That gets rid of that. So now let's heat this with our heat tool and then we'll compare. All right, so can you see the difference? So if you're heat embossing and you're finding that you're getting this powder scatter around your sentiment, it could be that you're not using an embossing buddy. It makes a huge difference in how your embossing looks on your project. All right, so next, let's take a look at using outline images. So sometimes using line art images can be a little tricky to get a really nice detailed image. So let's look at how we can assure getting a really pretty image when we heat emboss. I'm going to use metallic for this. I really like fine art, like the line art images stamped in metallic ink. I think it looks beautiful. So I'm going to use this bird from the Winterly Treetops stamp set from our September to December mini catalog. And I'm just going to stamp this in my Versamark ink. Again, your detailed images is where it's even more important to have a well-inked pad that you're working with so that you're not getting a dry stamped image. All right, so I'm going to put this in here and add my powder to my image. And it's okay to kind of tap lightly and let all that powder kind of drag. Oh, you know what I forgot to do? Do you know what I did? Look at, I forgot to use my embossing buddy. So see how that's just really messy? So we're going to start over. And we're actually going to, as soon as I put the powder on, I was like, oh, I know what I did. So we're going to re-stamp this. And try again. And you immediately can see a difference when you use that embossing buddy. See, without even really doing any work to get the excess powder off, you can see exactly where you used your embossing buddy. So this type of image is where having a little brush would be helpful. If you have powder stuck in areas where you don't want them, this actually looks pretty good. I think it's going to heat up really nicely. So let's add some heat and see how it looks. And again, you will start noticing it getting shiny and smooth as the heat tool melts the powder. So let's get this going. Getting a little warm. So can you see how it's getting shiny and bright? It's getting really pretty once that powder melts. And there is our line art image. Whoops. So you can still get beautiful detailed images even though you're using embossing powder. So this is just beautiful. You can die cut this and add this element to your project and it'll look wonderful. And then last but not least, let's switch to some black powder. So I think black and white powder are probably the trickiest to use, only because usually when you're embossing with black, you're on white paper. And when you're on black paper, you're using your white embossing powder. So that scatter becomes an issue. So I wanted to show you more of a solid image. And we're going to use this adorable little dog. And this little dog is also from the Enjoying the Little Things. You can see him right there. So let's stamp him in black powder. We're going to stamp in the Versamark. I should say let's emboss him with the black powder. But I'm going to close up my silver here so we don't have any little accidents of things we don't want. All right. So I have a little bit of powder. You can see that's accumulating in here. You can dump this in the garbage, or again, if you're doing several items with the same color, you can dump it right back in your container. So here's my black. Now this dog has some little solid areas on him, that's spots, and on his ears. And so I wanted to show you with a little more of a solid area, even though this is really little. I like to put the powder on sometimes and then just tap it around. You just really want to work the powder over the ink so that it really gets attached onto the stamped image. So again, oftentimes blowing on your image will get a lot of that loose ink off for you, but he's little, so I'm going to use my brush and just wipe some of this away. So this little brush will take some of those little bits of powder and you can just get them right off your image. And taking this little bit of extra time, and you can see how easy and fast that was. It took what, maybe 10-15 seconds. You can see how it will really make a difference getting rid of the scatter that's around your image so you have beautiful images on your projects. Now you can see how you have a nice clean image with no scatter, and you could cut this and stamp a cute sentiment there, or you could fussy cut this little image if you wanted to add to your project, and it's just beautiful. Now, one thing I do want to point out when you're embossing, after you've used your heat tool on your image, put your image at an angle so that it's catching the light, and make sure that the whole image is shiny. Every now and then you'll get a little spot that's dull and still powdery if you miss the spot. And if you touch that, it's going to wipe the image right off, and then you'll have to repeat your embossing. So just make sure you've gotten the whole area heated really nicely. All right, and then last but not least, I want to show you just a nice big word just because it's so pretty. And I'm going to do this in gold, and I'm going to heat on the Blackberry Bliss paper with some gold embossing powder. And I think this sentiment is just beautiful. So I thought, what a nice way to end our little tips video here. So again, we have gold embossing powder, and this is from the the Metallic Wow Basics collection. I'm going to use my embossing buddy and rub it all over my paper so I don't have that scatter. And this sentiment is from the Iconic Imagery stamp set. This is actually a bundle that's part of our online exclusives. You can find it online in my store. And I absolutely love this Celebrate sentiment. So I thought I would stamp that so that you could see how beautiful it is to add pretty words to your projects. So I'm just going to stamp this and give this ink just an extra second or two than what you would normally do, just to make sure it has a chance to transfer nicely. And now let's add our powder. So I'm just letting it fall right over my stamped image, but then I want to really give this a chance to go over all the ink. So again, give it a, you can blow on it, and that really does a nice job of getting any excess powder off. Now, if I did have any little bits and pieces stuff that I didn't want on there, that's when I would use one of my little brushes and just get it right off there. This one is nice for doing kind of around the non-detail parts. And then if you have a tiny one, you can do your detail parts to your image. Now let's warm it with our heat tool. You can see how beautiful this will be. You can see it starting to heat. Now you can see the difference. And so if you miss a little spot with the heat, you can see that area between the L and the B, that will wipe right off if you don't quite get heat on all of it. So make sure you double check it and make sure it's all heated really nicely. And now you have this beautiful element that you can add to your projects. So once again, let's take a look at what we did here and the differences between using your embossing buddy and not, and then using your brush to get stray scatter off your projects as needed. So I hope these tips and tricks help to give you perfect embossing every time. Have fun.